Hello and welcome to Royale Without Cheese, our bi-weekly podcast in which we discuss both the classic and the unknown of art and popular cinema from the then and now. We are your hosts, me, Tomás Ferreira, Leonardo Miranda,
Hello.
and Miguel Aido.
Hi.
This is our talk show segment where we welcome grand indie filmmakers to our wonderful couch and discuss their work. Duwayne Dunham is an American film and TV director and editor. He's best known for his collaborations with George Lucas and David Lynch, serving as editor on Star Wars, Return of the Jedi, Blue Velvet, and Wild at Heart. In 1990, he made his directorial debut with the second episode of the Twin Peaks series, also winning a Primetime Emmy Award for editing the pilot episode at the time. He subsequently directed the films Homeward Bound, Incredible Journey, Little Giants, and other numerous television films for Disney. In 2018, Duwayne reunited with Lynch to edit Twin Peaks: The Return, and more recently, his latest film as a director, alongside Lynch as an executive producer, Legend of the Happy Worker, premiered at this year's Locarno Film Festival. Happy Worker will be under discussion today, along with their past film collaborations. And so, Duwayne, how are we feeling today?
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Yeah, well, first of all, we need to congratulate you for your film's world premiere at Locarno Film Festival, of course. And to give a little context for the listeners at home who may not know, The Legend of the Happy Worker, starring Josh Whitehouse, Thomas Hayden Church, and Cole Meany, amongst many others, is this comedy western, a story about a simple man, Joe, a digger working for Goose, of course, a frontier industrialist, who rises to power, becomes corrupt, falls, and ultimately finds redemption. And so having seen it, I really thought it was a very unique take on this journey that is traditionally known. It's a note to hope in a weary world run by greed in its many shapes, as we see through the characters of Goose and Cleet, of course. And knowing that it was a play, The Happy Worker, by S.E. Feinberg, yes.
Feinberg, yeah.
We were wondering, what was your first impression upon reading the play? What attracted it to you, and how was the process of adapting it for the big screen?
Well, David Lynch gave me a copy of the play and eventually a copy of the first draft of a screenplay. And I was attracted to the dialogue. Because it's written by a playwright, generally playwrights understand dialogue. And it was always the dialogue. The story was always kind of, abstract, and it poses lots of big questions and offers no answers at all. So that's a bit unusual, especially for an American audience. But it was the dialogue, the patter of the dialogue, the speed of the dialogue, the rhythm of the dialogue that kept me coming back through the years as I would work on other projects. And I'd say, oh, The Happy Worker, maybe take it down from the bookshelf, give it another read, and see what happens.
And how was the process of adapting it? What was that exercise? Because it was given to you by David all the way in the 80s, I presume.
Yes, mid 80s, right after Blue Velvet. Every story has a time that I think where it resonates most. And I always wondered if The Happy Worker was ahead of its time, behind its time. It just, it appealed to me, but we had a difficult time getting it set up. The industry goes through phases and cycles of, certain kinds of movies. And this was very much a European sort of art house movie that I hope people, when they see, would go to the local coffee shop and have a discussion about it. And mainly, what did you make of this? What do you think it meant? That sort of thing. That's not really a common for an American audience.
Okay. So it's more the old cliche of like the spoon feeding, the perfect bow at the end of the story. Maybe that's what you mean, like the perfect message. That's what the audience is more accustomed to, and not so much the raising of answers and leaving it blank for the audience to finish.
I think just the subject of thinking, it causes you to think, or at least I would hope that that's something that happens when a person watches it.
Of course.
It makes you think, and American audience likes explosions and car chases and flesh, and not so much thinking involved in those things.
Of course. And but narratively speaking, now speaking those terms, it's interesting because a key interesting element to the story was how the purpose of the hole that Kus makes his workers dig for is really never explained. Even when he's questioned by his workers, this is kind of a key in the narrative. It's really interesting how you portray him as this benevolent boss who's really concerned with his workers' happiness. But you seem to explore him in this way in which he's this how should I put it? There's this play of smoke and mirrors that is not too dissimilar to the antagonist character of Cleet, who is this more technological savvy entrepreneur trying to rob him of his business. And so, would you say that this great parallel between both characters was always there? And what did you ultimately envision as the true happiness that a worker who may feel like a cog in a machine could achieve or is trying to achieve?
Well, the issues of control and oppression, my feeling was always, is Goose the good guy or is he the bad guy? Cleet
Okay.
kind of the same way. They both deal with control in different ways. And ultimately, the question of happiness is not something that I intended to answer with this movie. Like, what is happiness? But I wanted to at least put out the notion that, we're here. If you're lucky, you find a purpose, and what is your own meaning in life, and how do you get through it? Unfortunately, we're all subject to the kinds of control that both Cleet and Goose exhibit, if for no other reason, just to have a job. And some of us have jobs that we'd love to do, but even those jobs, sometimes you don't want to go to work that day.
Yeah, of course, yeah. I mean, Robert Ford, I think, had a line that was something along, happiness is a very, I'm paraphrasing here, but I've read it recently, and it's kind of apropos in the sense that, there's, people always pursue happiness, but it's a thing that flees in between your fingers. We live mostly with sadness, and then happiness is really the thing that comes momentously as we try to seek it out. It happens accidentally. So I think it's quite there as well. And yeah,
Yeah, regarding visual style, I mean, being aware that you had experience directing some late 90s and early 2000s Disney Channel films, it was a bit kind of undeniable to see a bit of their influence in the style of The Happy Worker, in the edits, in the color, and definitely the acting. Even to some extent, some of the wacky sound effects that are employed, and they all transpire this sense of happy small town Americana, kind of also present in Lynch's films. So, could you comment a bit on the aesthetic choice and what effect you were seeking with it?
I think for this particular movie, I wanted it to be timeless. So, I don't really set it in any particular time, though wardrobe vehicles tend to, dictate a time period. But this one, I wanted it to have this sort of timelessness about it. You don't know when it was, or could be the future, could be the past. It's just a fable. It's a fairy tale. And I think, you know, you when David Lynch gave me the script for Blue Velvet, when we had just met, and he called and asked me if I would cut Blue Velvet for him. And I was living up in San Francisco at the time, flew to LA, met David. He gave me the script, and I read the script, and I was not sure how I was going to answer him because it was very troubling. And so when we did speak, I said, David, I don't know. I just don't think this is my cup of tea. And he said, What do you mean it's not your cup of tea? And I said, Well, I'm more of a Disney kind of guy. And that's the answer to your question. We're all products of our upbringing, and we don't, yeah, they're bad people. You could say Goose, Cleet, um, but there's a sense of hope here that I think permeates the story. And I, as much as I've worked with Lynch, I can't do Lynch. I don't think anybody can. You just can't that's just who he is in his own DNA. What you see, even though it's small town America, he goes for the darker side. He goes for what's underground with the insects lurking beneath the nicely manicured lawn. And my style is a little bit different, but Where we are very similar is we both tend to shoot around the movie and find it in the cutting room. I just find it through performance and what was shot and what wasn't in the script, that sort of thing.
Yeah, but for sure, I think. I mean, you speak of the influence of Disney in your work, and I think it really helps in this film because you really sense the naivety of the characters through the that acting, and the whole situation through the colors and again the acting. It becomes kind of an absurdist tale. So I think it really helps to convey that sense of it's a fable, and there's hope involved in the characters. And I think, at least for me, even though you see the influence from where it came from, I think it really aids the story that you were trying to tell.
In many respects, the character of Joe is not too unlike Dopey in The Seven Dwarfs. You know, Dopey's just sort of naive and dopey. I mean, that's why he's got the name. But he's the one who's given the key to the mine, to the diamonds. And that's what, that parallel can be drawn with Joe as well.
Hmm. Yeah. And on that note, what was it like working with David again on this project, which was perhaps his last? Did he give you any creative input?
No, through the years, David was instrumental in being present in certain meetings, trying to get it set up and kind of loaning his name and influence. But once we got it set up, you know, David is very protective of his own vision, and consequently, he's very, very protective of another filmmaker's vision. He does not want to inject himself into that process at all. If you ask him a specific question, um, perhaps he would answer, but he really, and it's a great quality. He leaves it up to the individual. And it was interesting when we shot, we had discussions about casting and that sort of thing, but no script notes, anything like that. But um, when when I was in post and I had the movie together and I wanted his help, I wanted him to see it when I thought it was far enough along that the ideas were clear. And his producer, Sabrina Sutherland, we had just finished Twin Peaks together. Sabrina asked if she could be in the room with us. And I said, sure, that's not a problem. And so David and I sat down and we started talking about the movie, his impression of what he had just seen. And it was a short conversation, but when it was over, Sabrina came to me later in the day and she said, I want to thank you for letting me be a fly on the wall in that conversation. She said, I didn't understand a word of what you guys were saying. You obviously have this shorthand that, you're kind of completing one another's
Uh-huh.
sentence and thought, and I know where you're going. And yeah, yeah, yeah. And that's indicative of the relationship I had with David.
Yeah, on that note, like obviously Lynch was a very unique person and a collaborator with a lot of personality and a particular vision for his films. And it's interesting to see how there's an overarching intrigue in, for example, The Wizard of Oz and the fairy tale narrative throughout Blue Velvet, Wild at Heart. And we thought even like with The Legend of the Happy Worker, there's these notions of good versus evil, of finding hope in a dark world, and often even like the presence of characters seeking an answer to something broken in them. At least this seemed like something that connected both of you for us. And so we were wondering, back when you first started working with him as an editor on Blue Velvet, how did you first meet? And was there like a period of adaptation to fully get on his wavelength, which might be a necessary step?
Prior to working with Lynch, I worked with Lucas for a number of years. And oddly enough, I met both guys exactly the same way. One day the phone rang and somebody said, it's George Lucas wants to talk to you. And I was in denial. I was like, get out of here. Who is this? You know, who put you up to this? It's a friend of mine playing a prank. And they said, no, no, pass the phone along. And this voice comes on and says, hello, hello. This is George. I want you to come work with me. And I said, well, maybe you ought to meet me first. But okay. And then years later, the phone rang and it was some woman claiming to be David Lynch's assistant. I thought the same thing. She passed the phone along and I hear this, hello. I said, hello. And he says, this is David Lynch. I want you to cut Blue Velvet for me. I want you to come work with me. And I said, maybe you ought to meet me first. It worked once. Why not twice?
Exactly.
So we met. He had an office at Raleigh Studios right across the street from Paramount. I flew down to Los Angeles, met him, and we shared a couple of aw shucks and gee whizzes, and pretty much knew right away we're kind of simpatico that way. And as I said before, he gave me the script, and I went home and I read it and thought a lot about it. And I had a couple other opportunities of work. And David called and said, look, I need an answer now. I'm leaving for North Carolina where he shot the movie. And I need to know right now, are you going to do this or not? And I just quickly calculated on my hand the choices I had and said, who can I learn the most from? And that answer was very clear. It was David. If you are paying attention, you can learn an awful lot. And I say it this way. Once I was asked, what's it like working with David Lynch and George Lucas? Because most people think they're so different. They're not really different. They're very much alike. The way they move the camera, they use the camera. They both shoot around the movie. They both find it in the cutting room. But I describe what it's like working for Lucas and Lynch is I worked 7 years with George Lucas and he taught me how to build a box. And I worked in 7 months with David Lynch. He taught me how to take the lid off the box. And that's just David. David was always, I think, interested in the infinite in every instant. And it goes much deeper than the normal person would ever think to. I believe he walked through life seeing things in CinemaScope. Big, wide screen, lots of information, lots of stuff to study, and a real unique talent.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And there's a curious thing. You had seen David Lynch's film previously, Eraserhead, right? I think that was your first watch of it. Was it with George and Stanley Kubrick?
Yes. Yeah. We were at Elstree outside of London, shooting Empire Strikes Back, and Stanley was on the lot doing post-production on The Shining. And Kubrick called over to our cutting room one day and said, have you ever seen this movie, Eraserhead? And we both said, my goodness, no, we haven't. We've heard a lot about it. Would love to see it. And Kubrick said it's one of his favorite films. He'd seen it 35 or 40 times, and he'd be happy to run it for us at the theater on Friday night. So on Friday night, we went over 7:30, whatever it was, went into the theater on the lot there, and just the three of us sat down and watched Eraserhead. That was my introduction to David Lynch.
Quite the introduction.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
And Eraserhead's the longest 90 minutes in the history.
Did you and George like came out of the screening just talking about the film very, strongly about it, or?
No, because I would ride to and from the studio each day with George, and when that screening was over, I was just hoping that nobody would say something about having dinner, because that's such an oppressive experience. I just want to go back to my hotel and take a shower. And Kubrick says, hey, you guys want to go next door to the Grosvenor and have a meal? And I'm thinking, please, George, please say no. And we went over and had a meal. And then but the conversation wasn't really about the movie. And those two guys really they didn't talk about the movie at all, and nor did I really speak specifically about the film with George. But when you see a David Lynch movie, you have an experience. That's what he did so well. It may have troubled you, but if you can make somebody feel something emotionally, then you've done your job. And David knew how to do that.
And to mention one of his films, Blue Velvet, which was already mentioned here, there are many emblematic scenes in the film, of course. One of them that always grips me through its tension because it evolves so well through its stakes and the mise-en-scène is one of the scenes at Dorothy's apartment when we have Jeffrey for the first time hiding behind that famous wardrobe and observing her being abused by the antagonist Frank, played by Dennis Hopper. And it's a scene that so wondrously makes so much and evolves in such an unexpected ways through the dramatic questions that it poses regarding the characters, both of them, Jeffrey and even Dorothy's true intentions. And the way that it's framed with its monochrome color of red and always coming back to that wide shot, which I always find so interesting, almost framing the apartment as if it was a prison for Dorothy. It's a very haunting decision to keep in the edit that wide shot. And I just really want to ask if you could remember, what were perhaps some of the creative discussions behind the editing of that scene and perhaps the challenges, if any?
Well, it's interesting you should pinpoint that particular scene. It's always interesting to me that sort of purplish mauve color in Dorothy's apartment is so depressing. And so that scene, the characters in the scene, very difficult, very difficult. I'm sure it was difficult to shoot, but it was very difficult to watch the dailies and then sit, day after day and try and put this all together. But David and I had a running conversation through the entire post of Blue Velvet. So it probably lasted 5 or 7 months, something. And the discussion was one thing. I would say, is Dorothy a victim or a participant? And in typical David fashion, he'd say, well, what's it matter? He could be both. And I was like, yeah, but I need to know. I wasn't sure in the beginning why I needed to know. I just wanted to know. Blue Velvet was 3 hours and 57 minutes in its first cut, and it was a real good cut. It was just a few of us in the theater up in Berkeley and at Fantasy. And when it was over, I was nervous. It's the first time showing a cut to David Lynch, and he sat for a minute in silence, and then he turned to me and he nodded his head and he said, I like it. I really like it. He says, but I only have one problem. And I'm thinking to myself, well, this should be easy. One problem, we're done. He says, for me to have final cut, it's got to be under 2 hours. So we basically had to cut the movie down in half. And final release time of that movie is exactly 3 frames less than 2 hours in length, just in case the negative cutter made a mistake. So David would still be under that 2 hour and get his final cut. So there were things about Jeffrey's character. And really what that question was about the movie. The movie, and specifically the character of Jeffrey, the Kyle MacLachlan, because there's a scene of Dorothy after that horrible rape scene. She's in the bathroom and she's standing at the sink and there's blood in the sink and she's very traumatized and she's playing in the blood in the sink and she's mumbling over and over, hit me, hurt me, hit me, hurt me, over and over and over. And Jeffrey comes out of that closet and he goes down the hallway and he sees this. So my question was, if she's a victim, that's one thing. If she's a participant, what does that make Jeffrey? If he's privy to what she's saying there. And one night toward the end, we didn't talk about this much. It's just that was the one nagging, overreaching discussion we continued to have. And then one night we were running the reel, or that scene came by, and it's probably midnight, 1 a.m. And that moment comes by where Dorothy's at the sink, and David just yells out at basically the top of his lungs, "I got it!" And, scared me to death. You're running this thing, and I got it. What do you got? What? He says, I got it. I got it. Listen to this, guys. We're going to change hit me, hurt me to help me. You see how that just defined that, not just her character, it defined Jeffrey and the whole rest of the movie, because if she was a victim or a participant, she's saying, hit me, hurt, so what? Jeffrey's going to become Frank Booth? But if she's saying, help me, an audience, I believe, would be more sympathetic to him going back to her, regardless of any attraction. It wanted to help her. And it allowed us, the audience, to identify more closely with the character of Jeffrey. Huge shift.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Yeah.
Not many people could pull that off.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Sometimes those are the slight changes that make complete story kind of born anew. Yeah, definitely. Very interesting.
And then moving on to Wild at Heart, which we also love. We find there's an intermittence to the editing, in the sense that there's a lot of scenes that are punctuated by sudden cuts to other moments in parallel editing style, and there's also these dissolves to flashbacks, or even just like abstract insert shots of a lit match, of the cigarette, and even those shots of Lula's house burning. And so in this respect, Blue Velvet has a little bit of that. It's not as present, but it already has those traits, like showing the rotten here and things like that. So what do you feel like that this type of formal decision, these like stylistic choices, what do you think they bring to the feeling and the mood of both films and how it evolved?
The feel and the mood, that's all really created, that's David's magic, and it's created in the environments, it's created in the characters, the soundscape, the music, all of that. But specifically, and this is where Lucas and Lynch are very similar. They understand if something does not work. That was when my work with George was, does it work? Does it work? Does it work? Did we do that right? Does it work? Those two individuals in particular, they're not afraid of an answer that says, no, it doesn't work, because that the issue is not, does it work? Does it not work? If it doesn't work, we need to fix it. And I've seen it on George's movies, and I see it on especially Wild at Heart, because Wild at Heart was 4 hours and 27 minutes in the first cut. There was beautiful stuff there, but a lot of Wild at Heart is kind of the same stuff. And oddly enough, David had already shot the pilot episode of Twin Peaks. I had cut it. I was finishing the editing on the pilot episode when David walked in one day and said, I'm going to direct this thing, Wild at Heart. We're going to start in a couple of weeks. And that's when he told me that we got picked up 7 episodes initially for Twin Peaks. So prep was happening with Twin Peaks. Prep was happening with Wild at Heart. David went off and started shooting Wild at Heart. I transitioned over and started cutting Wild at Heart. And then I directed the first episode of Twin Peaks. So I took a break, about a 2-week break from the cutting room, went off, shot the episode. I finished shooting episode 1 of Twin Peaks on the same day David finished shooting the feature, Wild at Heart. Came back to the cutting room, had a powwow, and then David went off to direct episode 2 of Twin Peaks. But when we were cutting, it soon became clear that Wild at Heart does not work. And it was really long, had a lot of good stuff, but the overall story was not working. I edit in the cutting room a lot like a writer will use index cards, and I put it up on the wall so I can look at the wall and see in order what the scenes are. And so David and I said, it doesn't work. So what do? We stood up and I started moving cards around, and then David joined in and started moving. And it was almost a silent dance. We were on the same wavelength, but we were both moving cards and removing cards. We kind of knew where each were going. It was radical. I took the scene that ended Act 2 that would throw us into Act 3 in the linear storyline of Wild at Heart as scripted. And that's when Sailor kills Bobby Ray Lemon or whatever his
Oh,
name.
wow. Okay.
And I decided, okay, let's start the movie with this scene. So if we agreed to that, then that meant automatically we're going to have some flashbacks. And then David so embraced the idea that he started creating a visual style for the movie, the matches, some of the Wizard of Oz stuff. And we took scenes, sometimes 2 and 3 scenes, and I just put pieces of each and made it kind of one strange little scene. And that's how we went through and got Wild at Heart back together in a way that at least the two of us felt it did work. It worked so much better than that first version. But if you were to look at the numerical scene order of Wild at Heart, a script is numbered 1 through whatever in scene numbers. If you looked at those scene numbers the way Wild at Heart was released, it'll read like a bingo card. There's no rhyme or reason to any of those numbers. It's a feeling. Okay, where do we go from here? And it was a really very interesting experience, and not very many filmmakers that I'm aware of would be brave enough to do that.
Yeah, you mentioned that, you find the film in the edit. So you think that film with those particular challenges made him, and perhaps you change your mind in the way that you approach effectively, the way to write and then to edit the film. Do you think that he just embraced it casually like he would before, or in some way changed his perspective?
David has always, as much as if somebody asked, what does this mean? He would just, it doesn't matter. But I think for him, deeply, he was always searching for meaning in his work. I was going off to direct my first movie, and I asked George advice, and he said, yes, when you get to the cutting room, throw the script away. And to some people, I mean, I guess that means, yeah, literally you throw it away. But what he really was saying is the script is useless in the cutting room because now you have the film. The film is the film, and the film is going to tell you what it is and what it wants to be. And your job, it doesn't matter what the script said, it doesn't matter the description, none of it. Now you have the imagery, sound, and picture. And that's what's important. And that's what's unique about both those guys. They go to that cutting room and they let the film speak to them. Star Wars is a different kind of thing because it's so heavy with special effects that pre-production on a Star Wars was probably a year and a half, maybe more. And just detailed. But that didn't mean that there weren't changes in the script. I've never worked on a single movie in my entire career where the finished movie, the scene structure was the same as the script. It's something always changes. It just does. It's natural. It's not a fault. It's just that it doesn't want to be like that anymore. It was a little difficult, I think, for David to get used to my habit of not having the script. And on Blue Velvet, one day we were running something and he said, you didn't really cut it like the scene, like it was written. And I said, so? And he said, so I'd kind of like to see it one time how it was written. And I was like, why? And he says, hand me the script. And I said, I don't have it. And he says, well, where is it? And I said, I threw it away. And that pretty much defined our working relationship from that day forward, because I let the film speak to me. And that's what you do in there. And consequently, I have a habit. I edit like Lucas does. I turn the sound off. I just look at the picture. And then, David, specific to Wild at Heart, that had a really, really unusual soundscape, especially for that time. And he was going, he was pushing, maybe because we both knew it wasn't working in the beginning. And again, that's no fault of anything. What should be praised in a comment like that is at least if it's not working, you find a way to make it work. And I think we did do that with Wild at Heart.
So yeah, as a final note, how's the rest of the distribution looking for your film? And when can our listeners expect to see Legend of the Happy Worker available online? Do you have an idea?
Well, it should be, I don't have a exact timeline, but it'll be sometime fairly soon. We did have the world premiere at Locarno, and that was a very successful screening and a really interesting screening with so many people. And, I love that outside under the stars and gigantic screen. It was really an experience.
Yeah, it's always interesting to see it with an audience, of course, to see kind of what's the energy in the room regarding our own film. How do you feel in those moments, actually? I must ask.
You have to see it with an audience. If you don't, you're only hurting yourself, because there's a couple of reasons. One is, what I find, when you know there's somebody else in the room with you, you look at the movie differently. You have lost your control. I no longer have the forward stop reverse button in front of me. I can stop it at any time if I have a thought and go back and analyze or fix it. When you're in a screening, you become acutely aware of the audience. And are they paying attention? Are they fidgeting? And a case in point is Wild at Heart. We screened Wild at Heart at the Cary Grant Theater over at MGM one night. The theater holds 300 people. And we went in and we started that screening, and about 70 minutes into that screening, at the end of a scene, a certain thing happened, like that happens. Just a few seconds, but it happened. In that instance, 125 people jumped out of their seats and left the theater. That's a problem. Now, we didn't have that problem in the cutting room. We had no idea. And we were able to convince the studio that they had recruited the wrong audience. They, in fact, had recruited a Disney audience, and we needed a David Lynch audience. So they kind of looked at us like, yeah, brother. And they went out, got a so-called David Lynch audience, another 300 people. Same theater, same moment, 70 minutes in, bang. And another 125, 130 people jumped from their seats and left the theater. And those who stayed had turned violent on the movie. And they were yelling insults and things that were hurtful and just awful. So there's this thing where, as I said before, if you can make somebody feel something, you've really done your job. I don't care what medium you're working in. If you can make somebody feel something, you've done your job. And film is an emotional medium. And I liken this moment in Wild at Heart that you can lead your audience to the edge of the cliff, and you can nudge them so even their toes are off over the edge of the cliff. But the one thing you can't do is push them off the cliff. And that's what we did. We took them. It was so intense, that scene, we took them right to the edge and their little toes were dangling over it. And then we just gave them the major heave ho and off they went. And they didn't like that. Audience doesn't like that.
Of course.
And so we had to, we sort of had to recalibrate.
And that was the latest from Duwayne Dunham, folks. We would like to thank his presence here today. He's truly an excellent filmmaker, and remember to check out Legend of the Happy Worker once out on streaming platforms. If you're a filmmaker running the festival marathon, feel free to send us a message for an interview as well. We would love to promote your work. Don't forget to subscribe, share this interview, or simply give us a like. That's how our podcast can grow ever more groovy. And if you're on YouTube and want to see more interviews like this, check out this next video right here. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.
Adios.
Adeus.
Adios, amigos!